It's shaping up to be one of the most unpredictable general elections in living memory. As the parties fight for every advantage, we bring them together for the Daily Politics election debates. We've been through the manifestos, and now we'll put to the test some of the people who want to form the next government, wield influence and make the big decisions about the issues that will affect this country after May the 7th. Welcome to the Daily Politics election debates of 2015. I'm Andrew Neil. Today we're focusing on foreign affairs. It's an area of policy that so far hasn't been a big feature of the campaign. But from Europe to the Middle East and to the southern shores of the Mediterranean, it presents some of the toughest challenges for whichever party wins power. Phillip Hammond is the Foreign Secretary. He's a Conservative. William Dartmouth represents UKIP. Tim Farron is the Lib Dem Foreign Affairs spokesman. Patrick Harvie represents the Green Party, and Douglas Alexander is Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary. Plus, I'm joined by the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, Bridget Kendall. Now, in a moment, our politicians will be setting out why they believe they've got the right answers in this important area. But first, here's a reminder of what's at stake. Britain's relationship with Europe is set to be one of the dominant issues facing the country following the general election. With David Cameron committed to a referendum on our membership of the EU, voters could have their first say on whether to be in or out of the club since 1975. Surging immigration from a continent still mired in economic stagnation has added to pressure to change the way the EU works, even if there is no referendum. Beyond Europe's borders, Russia poses the greatest threat since the Cold War. But as the West struggles to decide how to respond to Russian aggression, has Britain, now reduced military power, been left on the sidelines? The armed forces are smaller and we're less keen to use them. The legacy of UK involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan has meant we stayed out of Syria and have only played a supporting role in action to tackle the so-called Islamic State terrorists. So in the next hour, we'll be asking what is the best way to use our nation's influence on these defining issues, and how would each of the parties shape the part Britain plays on the global stage. Well, just before we came on air, our politicians drew lots to decide the order in which they would make their pitches. Phillip Hammond was the lucky winner, or loser, depending on your point of view. So, Phillip Hammond, please take your position. Phillip Hammond has been Foreign Secretary since last year. He took over from William Hague, and before that, he was the Defence Secretary. Phillip Hammond.
Over the last 5 years, we've restored the credibility of British foreign policy and refocused the Foreign Office on three clear objectives: protecting our security, promoting our prosperity and projecting our values. We've expanded Britain's diplomatic network. We're helping British firms win business around the globe, and we've replaced Labour's sofa government with a proper National Security Council. In Europe, we're leading the debate about a more competitive, more accountable EU. A Conservative government will negotiate a new deal for Britain in Europe, but the final decision will be made by you, the British people, in an in-out referendum in 2017.
Phillip Hammond, in a recent poll, you were rated as the least recognised senior minister in the cabinet. The public confused you with Jeremy Hunt and Julian Assange. Is such a low profile intentional, and is it symbolic of our foreign policy?
Well, our foreign policy is anything but low profile, but I think I'm very flattered by the being confused with Jeremy Hunt, since he's about 15 years younger than me and much better looking than me, Andrew.
Very diplomatic, as would suits a Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much. Now, William Dartmouth is a UK's MEP for South West of England, which includes Gibraltar. He used to be a Conservative. He's now the UKIP party spokesman for international trade.
UKIP wants to cooperate with other countries. We want to be friends with other countries. We want to trade with other countries. And this would be through the UN Security Council, of which the UK is a permanent member, through the World Trade Organization, and over 100 other international organisations, of which the UK is a member in its own right. However, so as long as we're in the European Union, so long will the UK's continuing membership of these bodies be uncertain and at risk. Already, the UK's seat on the World Trade Organization has been relegated to observer status since 1975, precisely because we are members of the EU. The EU diminishes our role in international affairs.
William Dartmouth, what does it say about UKIP foreign policy that both Nigel Farage and your MEP colleague Diane James have expressed their admiration for Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's not quite what they said. They simply said, would that we had a leader in this country who stood up for British interests in the same way that Vladimir Putin stands up for Russian interests. The fact of the matter is that we as a party believe in Britain, we believe in an independent Britain, and very sadly, the other parties, particularly the establishment parties, do not.
Thank you very much. Now, Tim Farron was president of the Liberal Democrats until last year. He's now the party's foreign affairs spokesman, and he's often tipped as a possible future Lib Dem leader.
Liberal Democrats believe British foreign policy should focus on promoting peace, human rights, democracy and trade, and countering the global threat of climate change. We believe all people, regardless of ethnicity, disability, religion, gender or sexual orientation, deserve a freer, greener and more prosperous world. That is why we met our commitment to give 0.7% of gross national income in foreign aid, why we want to end violence against women within a generation, why we created the International Climate Fund for the poorest, and why we say no to like-for-like Trident replacement. We want Britain to be leaders in the world. We must be, therefore, at the heart of the European Union and not cut ourselves off from our strongest friends and allies. Our priority must be to prevent conflict through strong international institutions and build peace using trade, aid, diplomacy and military cooperation. Only then will we have a freer, greener and more prosperous world.
Tim Farron, a native Nick Clegg says that you had to be given, quote, an embarrassing Sarah Palin-style foreign affairs training. So did they give you the Bluffer's Guide to Foreign Policy for this debate?
I read this also. I mean, this afternoon there's 5 of us who have keen interest in world affairs. We may have different views, but have an equal passion, I would say. Very foolish if any of us didn't spend some time brushing up on what's going on. As you know yourself, Andrew, in the last few days, our international position has changed very significantly. You should always stay on top of these things.
All right, Tim Farron, thank you. Now, Patrick Harvie is a member of the Scottish Parliament and the convener of the Scottish Green Party. He was also a prominent figure in the campaign for Scottish independence.
Once upon a time, not so very long ago, politicians in this country spoke of an ethical foreign policy. Very quickly, that began to sound like a sick joke, as we saw not only, most disastrously, the intervention in Iraq, but this country continuing to fall lockstep with the American foreign policy interests and the interests of big business against the common good, against the security and well-being of people around the world. Too often, we're making worse the problems which face the world around us, whether that's climate change, whether it's global poverty and inequality, or indeed the arming of despotic and tyrannical regimes around the world. These things are still happening. We're still making many of these problems worse, not better. We have the opportunity to change direction, contribute to the well-being of the world on a shared basis, and recognise that our security and well-being is something we must achieve collectively.
OK, now you've worked with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. So what's your advice to Ed Miliband if he has to do the same in Westminster?
Be careful, but don't look a gift horse in the mouth. There are opportunities, I believe, for political parties to work together where genuine common ground exists, and that doesn't need to prevent you from being clear and challenging where there are sincere and honest differences. That's the way we've operated in the Scottish Parliament. I think Westminster could do with a dose of genuine, honest-to-goodness, multi-party democracy.
All right, thank you for that. Douglas Alexander is Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary. He served as International Development Secretary in Gordon Brown's government. He's also the man in charge of Labour's election strategy.
This election is a choice between the Conservatives' failing plan and a better plan from Labour. That isn't just about how we make sure working people succeed. It's also about how Britain succeeds in a challenging and changing world. Sadly, in the face of new and emerging threats as well as enduring challenges, David Cameron has overseen the greatest loss of British influence for a generation. When it comes to Europe, he has spent years burning bridges instead of building alliances. Many Conservatives, including Phillip Hammond, now say they would vote to leave the European Union, despite the damage that would do to our economy and the millions of UK jobs that rely on our links with Europe. Labour believes that the right course for Britain is reform in Europe and not exit from Europe. because there is nothing splendid about isolation in the 21st century.
Douglas Alexander, if, as the polls predict, you lose your seat at the election, will you see if there are any job vacancies with David Miliband's aid charity in New York?
Well, we share something in common, Andrew. We both know Paisley, and I can assure you that on the ground there's a great deal of support coming Labour's way. But frankly, we have a principle that we're working to in this election, which is not having a post-match analysis before a ball is kicked. So I believe that of all the parties represented here today, the party with the strongest possibility of securing a clear majority is and remains the Labour Party. Victory is within our grasp.
All right, Douglas Alexander, thank you. Let's begin with Britain's place in the world. Phillip Hammond, we will stand with you every step of the way. That's what David Cameron told the Libyan people after Gaddafi was toppled. In fact, you've abandoned them to civil war, armed gangs, death and destruction, and the current tragedy now on the Mediterranean Sea.
Well, we're working very hard to ensure a positive outcome in Libya. The UN Special Representative right now is in Rabat with the different parties and is giving us a relatively upbeat assessment of the likelihood of forming a government of national unity. The meeting in Luxembourg yesterday was primarily, of course, we talked about the humanitarian tragedy as well, but was primarily about how the EU is going to get behind a government of national unity in Libya to enable that country to stabilise and to enjoy the fruits.
But you said we will stand with the Libyan people every step of the way. I mean, you must know how bad it is from the diplomatic cables you get. Well, actually, you don't, because we don't even have an embassy there. That's what it is standing by these people. We don't even have an embassy. That's how bad it is.
Well, along with almost all of our partners, we've had to withdraw our embassy from Tripoli across the border into Tunisia because of the security situation on the ground. But we have a Prime Minister's Special Envoy who's worked very closely with the UN Special Envoy to get these talks going. And please don't talk them down. They are beginning to come together. The two opposing regimes that occupy different parts of the country are now talking to each other in Rabat. And I think we should be optimistic that we will at last see a break in the civil war that's been going on in Libya for the last 2.5 years.
Douglas Alexander, was it a mistake to intervene in Libya?
No, I think we would have seen Benghazi turned into a slaughterhouse unless there had been action taken. But alas, I have to disagree with the rather rose-tinted perspective that Phillip is suggesting, because the truth is there was not a plan for the peace afterwards, and notwithstanding the grand statements that we heard both from Prime Minister Cameron and President Sarkozy, there was a basic failure of post-conflict planning. And as a consequence of that, we've seen not just the two governments that Phillip has described, but also the rise of the militias within Libya itself. And that explains some of the humanitarian tragedies that we've witnessed on our television screens in recent days.
Bridget.
Yeah, Phillip Hammond, could I just pick up with you on the news that's preoccupying everyone about these migrants in the Mediterranean? Yesterday you said we've got to tackle the criminals and put an end to this vile trade. Yeah. But surely these migrants coming across the water, it's not just that. It's partly about the fact that Libya is a failed state, which followed in part Britain's intervention in the country. And there's a bigger problem, isn't there? What do you do to stop the aspirations of these people who want to make these dangerous crossings?
Well, first of all, these migrants are not people who originate in Libya. Almost entirely they're using Libya as a transit route because of the civil war that's going on there and the fact that it is an ungoverned space at the moment. So what we've got to do, several different things. We've got to work in the countries that they are coming from, using our aid budget to improve conditions there. Many of them are refugees from the Syrian conflict. We're pouring £800 million into supporting people who've been displaced during that Syrian conflict.
The Syrians are the single biggest group of migrants on these boats.
They are.
What good is the aid doing? Eritrea, which Bridget was telling me, is one of the countries we give the most aid to. The boats are full of Eritreans. It's a nonsense to say that this aid is going to stop this mass migration across the Mediterranean.
No, it isn't a nonsense. It would be far, far worse if we were not pouring aid into those countries. Of course, we have to try and support people in their countries of origin. We also have to take action against the criminal gangs, many of them linked with international terrorist organisations.
Foreign Secretary, how could it be far, far worse when the European Union said yesterday there are between 500,000 and 1 million migrants waiting to come across the Mediterranean? How much worse could it be?
There are 7 million people displaced in Syria, many of them being supported by